Welcome back to another study of the Psalms. We are going to do our third lesson from Psalm 18, and I think in this lesson finish the psalm. We are going to be specifically looking at verses 31 through 50 of the 18th Psalm and discussing some lessons from therein. The 18th Psalm, as we have already seen in our previous two discussions of it, is themed in the first verse of the psalm. I love you, O Lord, my strength. David writing is expressing his love for God and his understanding that it is God who gives him his strength. I want to reread for you the introduction to the psalm, the heading of the psalm, because it's going to be relevant in our discussion of the final part of the psalm. The heading reads, "To the choir master, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who addressed the words of this song to the Lord on the day when the Lord rescued him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul." Now, as we talked about in our first lesson, some of the imagery of the psalm harkens us back to 1 Samuel chapters 23 and 24 when David is hiding in caves from Saul. But the heading, this is the day when God rescues David from all his enemies, as well as the conclusion in verses 48 through 50 thereabout, would lead me personally to believe that David is not writing this from the moment of hiding, but rather from maybe his coronation, when finally he ascends to the throne of Israel, or it could even be much later in life towards his death. But I tend to think this is probably a coronation psalm. This is an expression of David's feeling of triumph as he becomes king over Israel. And he identifies again God as his strength and as the source of his victory. Let's go ahead and read verses 31 through 50 of the psalm. It's a semi-lengthy reading, but then we're going to make some comments and observations about it. David writes, "Who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? The God who equipped me with strength and made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your right hand supported me. In your gentleness made me great. You gave a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and did not turn back till they were consumed. I thrust them through so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For you equipped me with strength for the battle. You made those who rise against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, and those who hated me I destroyed. They cried for help, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. I beat them fine as dust before the wind. I cast them out like the mire of the streets. You delivered me from strife with the people. You made me the head of the nations. People whom I had not known served me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners came cringing to me. Foreigners lost heart and came trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation, the God who gave me vengeance and subdued peoples under me, who delivered me from my enemies. Yes, you exalted me above those who rose against me. You rescued me from the man of violence. For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing to your name. Great salvation he brings to his king, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever." Now, as we break apart these verses, in particular, verses 31 through 42, David talks about God giving him strength for the battle. In verses 43 through 50, David describes victory over the nations. Verses 46 through 48, David is exalting God. And then finally in verses 49 through 50, he praises God for exalting him to be his king, and he praises God for establishing his line forever. And so as you look through these verses, again, at the end there when it talks about David as the anointed, and David being king, and David's line being established, we're moving ahead in time from David hiding under Saul to David sitting on the throne. And so David's speaking from that position of kingship in the psalm. Now I don't have time to discuss every single verse of this psalm, but I want to make some general observations about it. First of all, as we look at the idea of victory within the psalm, a phrase that comes to mind for me is all of God and none of self. And really, as we seek to be God's servants, this should be our goal, to give God all the glory and all the praise and all the honor. And this is what David does here within this psalm. He gives God praise for his strength, for his abilities, and for his victory. He really takes no credit for the actions he has undertaken in order to achieve this victory. He talks about it, about going to battle, running his enemies through, trampling them to dust under his feet, and casting them out. But he does so with the understanding he is only able to do this with the strength that God supplies. I do want to take a moment in verse 41 to notice the idea of competing prayers. That is, as David is gaining his victory through the strength that God supplies, the wicked and the violent cry out, and David asks the question in verse 41, or doesn't ask the question, but he supplies an answer. There was none to save. They cried for help, but there was none to save. Now the question is, who was listening to them? And David's answer is, nobody is listening to them. There is an idea embedded here about the question, who's going to answer the prayers of the wicked, especially when they want victory over the righteous and salvation from the wrath of God. And the answer is, there's nobody to answer such prayers. God is going to be with his people, and it is offensive to God and to his children to think that God is going to favor the enemies of his children over his children. Moreover, God is not responsible for answering the prayers of all men. It is the effective, fervent prayer of the righteous which works and is powerful to accomplish its goals. The prayers of the wicked, we are rightly instructed, God does not answer the prayers of sinful men. And so if you will not turn to God in righteousness and for righteousness, he's not going to be answering your prayers. I will also reiterate, and I've reiterated this in the previous two lessons, but there's a definite foreshadowing of Christ, especially in verse 50, the descendants of David being on the throne, being established forever. God is going to be with David's line forever, and Christ is the fulfillment of that. And I've already talked about the elements, the messianic elements of this psalm, where we can see, though historically it's about David, there's a definite foreshadowing and typology of Christ within the psalm, so that as David is speaking, we can hear Christ speaking the same words. And with that in mind, we turn to verses 43 through 45, where David talks about the foreigners, other nations, submitting to him and to his rule. And while this was partially true in his life, and even more true in the life of his son Solomon, where other nations came and paid tribute to Israel, it was even more true of Jesus Christ, who through the preaching of the gospel, through his apostles and through his church, took the message of God to all the nations, to peoples not yet known to God's people. And those men heard the word and they submitted to Christ, so that foreigners came out of their strongholds into the stronghold and into submission to God's kingdom. Now, with all that being said, I want to take the remainder of the time to make a very specific point within these verses, especially the latter half here of this psalm, about the warfare of the saint. And let me start by saying there is in the psalm an inherent tension between the denunciation of the wicked as violent people. In verse 48, we see this. The violent is the wicked. The wicked are violent people. But there's a tension between that and the violent imagery David employs concerning his own actions. And some might see this as hypocritical, where you're allowed to be violent in the cause of God, but violence in the cause of wickedness is wrong. And while there is some truth to that, and there is such a thing as righteous battle, it's useful to understand here that the violent imagery David is employing concerning his own actions is not strictly a literal one. Because if we go back to the heading, and remember at the very beginning I reread the heading saying this is going to be pertinent. The heading talks about David's victory over Saul. But if we go back to the book of 1 Samuel, we see David refusing to fight Saul. He did not go to war against the Lord's anointed, who was Saul. He did not fight against his king. He owed Saul allegiance, and even though he had to flee for his life from Saul, he never raised a hand against Saul. Saul, in 1 Samuel 31, was killed by the Philistines, with possibly, we have the suggestion in 2 Samuel chapter 1, that the last and final blow came from an Amalekite man who perhaps was in Saul's army, and whom David incidentally executed for just the claim of having killed King Saul. And so Saul was not killed by David. He wasn't trampled underfoot by David. And the psalm purports to be about David's final victory over his enemies. And from that day when the Lord rescued him from the hand of Saul. But David didn't achieve that victory by taking up arms. And therefore, the imagery in relationship to being saved from Saul and saved from other enemies must be understood poetically and metaphorically. Now, having said that, we can apply the same lesson, same principle to Jesus, who, if the psalm is to be taken messianically, Jesus triumphed over the world, and yet he never took up arms against his enemies. He won his victory by submitting to the scribes and the Pharisees and the Romans and allowing them to crucify him. And yet he still triumphed, and he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. His reign is eternal, and he will have ultimate victory over all the world as he judges the world in righteousness. But if we apply this to the coronation of Jesus on the cross and in the resurrection, there's no violence that Jesus engaged in order to achieve that victory. And the imagery becomes even more metaphorical, because David was a man of war. Jesus was a child of peace. Now, I say that to lead into an application to us. There are very often those who want to take the martial imagery of the Bible and apply it literally, thinking to themselves God wants them to go out and win major battles by crushing people under their feet, stabbing them through the heart, and driving away all the wicked physically and violently. But God does not need us to take up literal arms for him any more than he needed David to take up arms in order to overcome Saul, or he needed Jesus to take up arms in order to overcome the world. Rather, the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14, our weapons of warfare, they're not of the flesh. We're not fighting with physical weapons, but we do have powerful weapons for God. And God requires us to be strong in him as we fight a spiritual battle. And thus in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18, we have Paul telling us to be strong in the Lord, in the power of his might, to put on the full armor of God, the full panoply of God, and we will be victorious And that armor includes his word and prayer and righteousness and truth. And in Psalm 18, David also talks about a full panoply. And I'm not going to go through all the verses, but verse 33, you have the feet secured like a deer. You have hands trained for war. In verse 35, you have a shield. And so David has a similar imagery. It's not identical, but it's a similar imagery. And we as Christians are to take up the full panoply, the full armor of God, and be strong in the Lord, and let God be our strength. And if we can trust in God and let God be our strength, we will be victorious. It's when we trust in ourselves and think that we need to do it for God that we're going to fail. Remember that David praised God for his strength, his abilities, and his victories, and it was all God and none of self. And we need the same mentality in our lives. There's so much more that could be said about this psalm, but we're going to leave it there. I encourage you to read it and reread it and make some of your own applications to the psalm. But I pray that this lesson over Psalm 18 has been beneficial to you. And until our next time together, God bless you, and you have a great day.